The workshop was alive with movement, the air charged with the weight of preparation. Gunnar stood in the armory, hands braced against the steel table, as he surveyed the organized chaos around him. Crates of ammunition were stacked against the walls, weapons lined up in perfect order. But the reality was clear. They were running short on enchanted rounds, and with a war coming, every bullet counted. Eli stormed in like a woman on a mission, tablet in hand, eyes flashing with frustration. She was still in her work gear, her silver hair pulled back into a loose braid, oil stains on her fingers from working on the Wolfmobile's systems. She didn't waste time with greetings. "We have a problem," Gunnar exhaled through his nose. "Yeah? Which one? 'Cause I got a list." Eli didn't blink. "Ammo." Gunnar's single blue eye flicked to the tablet she slid across the table. The numbers glowed on the screen, grim and unforgiving. 100,000 rounds of 5.56mm. Sounds like a lot, but in prolonged combat, that wouldn't last. 1,000 rounds of 7.62mm for the 240B. Barely enough for sustained fire. 150 rounds of 40mm. Damn near precious. Each enchanted round had to be hand-etched, spellbound and tested. There was no mass production, no factory line, just painstaking craftsmanship, meaning every bullet spent was a bullet lost until they could make more. Gunnar ran a hand through his beard, eyes narrowing. "We load everything in belts and magazines. 1 enchanted round, 1 tracer, 2 regular." He set the tablet down. "Make it stretch." Eli nodded but didn't move. "There's more," she said. Gunnar gave her a look that told her to just say it. She crossed her arms. "We're burning through our stockpile too fast. Once this fight starts, we won't be able to resupply fast enough. I've already factored in careful use, but enchanted rounds are our biggest edge, and they don't grow on trees." Gunnar tapped his fingers against the steel, thinking. "How much time would you need to make more?" Eli sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Not the issue. The artisans are maxed out. They can only etch and enchant so much, and with the packs of ammo I'm prepping for the Wolfmobile and every operator getting a full battle load, we're already stretching it." "Meaning?" "Meaning if this fight drags on, we're going to be picking our shots carefully or switching to straight mundane rounds." Gunnar muttered a curse. They weren't a damn army. Not in numbers, anyway. Their strength came from precision, from superior firepower combined with magic, and if they had to start switching to mundane rounds halfway through a war against supernatural forces, they were screwed. Before Eli could argue, the armory door swung open, and Aletheris strode in, his movements as fluid as a river's current. The usual pristine elegance of an elf was marred by smudges of arcane residue on his leather workshop coat, a sign of his long hours at the forge. "You're discussing the ammunition concerns," he stated, his piercing blue eyes scanning between them. "No, we were just talking about what's for dinner," Eli deadpanned. "Yes, we're talking about the damn ammo." Aletheris, unbothered by her sarcasm, set down a heavy steel case onto the workbench. The latches clicked open, revealing 150 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, each meticulously engraved with intricate elven runes. The rounds gave off a faint silver glow, a sign of the magic carefully woven into their core. "This batch is finished," he said, looking directly at Gunnar. "For Dzera's rifle, they will cut through enchantments, barriers, and anything less than a god." He hesitated, then added, "Though she should still be selective with her shots. We won't have enough for waste." Eli whistled low, lifting one of the heavy rounds. "Damn, these are gorgeous." Dzera, leaning in the doorway, smirked as she stepped forward, claiming the case with an appreciative nod. "They'll do." Gunnar crossed his arms. "Good, but we're going to need a hell of a lot more than that." Aletheris met his gaze. "Then it is fortunate I can take a shipment to Alfheim." That caught Eli's attention. She straightened. "You're heading back?" Aletheris nodded. "We do not have the numbers here to engrave and enchant at the pace needed. But in Alfheim, we have 4 trained artisans who specialize in this work. If I bring them a stockpile of unenchanted rounds, we can return with far more ammunition than we could ever create alone." Gunnar considered it. How fast can they work? Aletheris exhaled slowly. With priority placed on the process? A week, possibly less. Eli frowned. That's cutting it close. Everything is cutting it close, Gunnar said, then turned back to Aletheris. How much can you carry? Aletheris glanced at the stockpiles in the armory. I can transport 20,000 rounds of 5.56mm, 5,000 of 7.62mm, and 1,000 more .50 caliber rounds. That is the limit of what I can safely bring through the portal at once. Eli ran a hand through her hair, considering. That still leaves us low on numbers. We ration, Gunnar said. Aletheris gave a firm nod. Then I will depart within the hour. Expect my return in 5 days. Gunnar gripped his shoulder briefly, a silent understanding between warriors. Make sure you come back. Aletheris smirked. Wouldn't miss it. As he left the armory, Eli sighed, rubbing at the smudge on her cheek. We should have started this weeks ago. Didn't have weeks, Gunnar said simply. We have now. Eli rolled her eyes, but there was no real bite behind it. I'll prep the shipment. Gunnar nodded, already moving. Good. Because when Aletheris gets back, we won't be waiting. Gunnar sat in his office, the dim glow of the holographic interface casting harsh blue light across his face. His fingers tapped impatiently against the desk as he waited for the connection to stabilize. It had taken 3 separate attempts to get through to Aeliana. The shimmering image of the Alfheim Council chamber finally materialized in front of him. Towering, ornate columns of silver-etched stone loomed behind Aeliana, their runic inscriptions glowing faintly in the candlelight. It was an image of serenity, one that was completely at odds with the expression on Aeliana's face. She looked exhausted. Her silver hair, usually impeccably arranged, was slightly disheveled. Her piercing blue eyes held a sharp frustration, her jaw set in a tight line. This had better be good, Gunnar, she said, her voice carefully even. That's my line, he shot back, folding his arms. What the hell is going on over there? I reached out 3 times. Aeliana exhaled, rubbing at her temple. The council, she said, voice laced with irritation. They refuse to move. Gunnar's fingers clenched. They refuse to... He stopped himself, inhaling deeply through his nose. We don't have time for their games, Aeliana. Oh, believe me, I know, she muttered, turning slightly as muffled voices echoed from somewhere behind her. The council was still in session. She had likely stepped away just to take this call. Gunnar narrowed his eye. What's the hold-up? Aeliana let out a bitter laugh. What isn't? Half the council refuses to believe that an outright war is even coming. They call it a skirmish among mortals, claiming it isn't our place to interfere. Gunnar's jaw ticked. And the other half? They agree Earth is at risk, but they're demanding endless deliberation on how much support is appropriate. She shook her head. We are at an impasse. Gunnar scoffed. That's a fancy way of saying they're too afraid to commit. Aeliana's silence was answer enough. Gunnar leaned forward, voice dropping lower. Where does Melorian stand in all this? Aeliana sighed. He's on our side. He sees the danger for what it is, but even he can't force their hand. Not yet. He's using every argument, every precedent he can pull, but they refuse to see this war as anything but Earth's problem. Gunnar ran a hand down his face. Typical. Elven politics are worse than human politics, he muttered. Aeliana gave him a dry look. That's an understatement. He exhaled through his nose. This wasn't what he wanted to hear. If the council refused to act, Earth was left with whatever support Aeliana and Melorian could provide off the books, which wasn't nearly enough. Gunnar's voice turned cold. So tell me, how long before they make up their minds? Aeliana hesitated. Days, weeks. It depends on how hard Melorian pushes. We don't have weeks, Aeliana, Gunnar growled. I'm aware, she snapped back before exhaling sharply. I'm trying, Gunnar, but if we push too hard, we risk them shutting down all aid entirely. That gave him pause. The last thing they needed was Alfheim cutting off the limited resources they already had. Gunnar flexed his fingers, his mind already turning through alternatives. So what do we do? Aeliana folded her arms. We work with what we've got. Aletheris is handling the enchanted ammunition. The Elven guards already stationed at the workshop are reinforcing your defences as best they can. And She hesitated, then continued. I'm keeping the Council from completely dismissing this war before it begins. Gunnar gritted his teeth. He hated this, hated the waiting, hated the politics. But he trusted Aeliana. Even if the Council was blind, she wasn't. He exhaled slowly. All right. You do what you have to do. But when this war hits, don't expect me to wait on them. Aeliana's lips curved slightly. I would never make the mistake of expecting patience from you, Gunnar. Despite himself, he smirked. But the moment faded as the voices behind her grew louder. Aeliana turned slightly, glancing over her shoulder before returning her gaze to him. I have to go, she said, but Gunnar, watch your back. Gunnar raised a brow. That a warning or a threat? Her expression turned serious. A warning. If Draven and Ravina are moving, they're not the only ones, and there are forces out there watching you. The line cut out before he could respond. The glowing projection flickered, then vanished, leaving Gunnar alone in the dimly lit room. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the empty space where Aeliana's image had been. Gunnar sat at his desk, running a hand down his face as he processed Aeliana's report. The Council's useless stalling wasn't a surprise, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. They were on their own. Again. With a deep breath, he flipped open his secure comms and scrolled until he found the one name he needed. Sophia Carlyle, Homeland Security. She answered on the first ring. I was wondering when you'd call, Sophia said, her voice sharp and knowing. Gunnar leaned back in his chair. What have you heard? She let out a dry chuckle. I don't have to hear much. You don't check in unless something's going to hell. So, what is it this time? Supernatural invasion? Rogue faction? Someone finally put a bullet in Derren? Gunnar smirked despite himself. Not yet, but give it time. Sophia's tone sobered. You need something. Yeah. Reinforcements. There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. Gunnar knew her well enough to picture it, her sitting at her cluttered desk, flipping through classified files while balancing a coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. All right, she said. Tell me what's coming. Gunnar laid it out for her. Draven, Ravener, the Black Dawn's growing influence, the war that was no longer a question of if, but when. Sophia didn't interrupt, but he could hear the way her breathing slowed. She knew this was bigger than the usual skirmishes. By the time he was finished, there was no humour in her voice. Damn, she muttered. That's worse than I expected. Gunnar didn't waste time. We need to reinforce the facility. It's our fallback point if the workshop falls. We can't afford to lose it. Sophia exhaled sharply. You know the facility isn't built for magical defense. It's off-grid for a reason, strictly covert. No enchanted weapons, no mystical wards, no glowing runes. I know, Gunnar said, voice even. But it has bodies, trained operatives, ex-agents who know how to fight and won't flinch when the first unnatural thing comes at them. Sophia was silent for a long moment then. I'll send a detachment. Gunnar raised an eyebrow. That easy? Oh, don't get excited. He could hear the smirk in her voice. I'm not doing this because you asked nicely. I'm doing it because I don't like getting blindsided. If this war's coming, then I want my people ready before we're up to our necks in eldritch nightmares. Smart. That was why Gunnar worked with her. How many can you spare? He asked. 30. She didn't even hesitate. And before you bitch about the number, I'm sending my best. Field agents, ex-special forces, people I trust to hold the damn line if it comes to that. Fine. Gunnar nodded. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. And right now they needed every advantage they could get. There's more, Sophia added. The facility's got a full staff of 100 trainees and 50 support personnel. That's enough to hold defensive positions. They might not have enchanted weapons, but they're not amateurs. I'll make sure they know what's coming. Good, Gunnar said. Get them ready. And what about you? Sophia asked, voice turning sharp again. What's your next move? Gunnar's gaze drifted toward the war map on the wall, toward the growing list of enemy factions, the tangled mess of alliances and betrayals. We hit first, he said simply. We don't wait. Sophia let out a low whistle. You always were the aggressive type. It's kept me alive this long. A pause. Then her voice dropped lower. And if you don't make it out of this one, Gunnar smirked, then you're in charge of making sure Derren doesn't take my chair. There was a beat of silence before Sophia laughed. Christ, now I have to keep you alive. Gunnar chuckled, but it faded as the weight of everything settled back on his shoulders. Send your team in by tomorrow night, he ordered. And Sophia? Yeah? Make sure they're ready for war. The line went dead. The garage bay of the workshop was a controlled mess. Tools scattered, half-assembled equipment, and the faint hum of arcane energy pulsing from the charging stations. Overhead, lights buzzed faintly, casting flickering shadows over the beast of a machine parked in the center, the Wolfmobile. Derren stood in front of it, arms crossed, expression set. He'd been elbow-deep in repairs for hours getting the vehicle up to combat standards. Eli and Ashley were usually there to help, but now Eli was being pulled in 10 different directions prepping gear, and Ashley, she was deploying with the forward team. That left him alone, and he had thoughts about that. Eli, still tapping away at her holodisplay, glanced over. You look pissed, Derren snorted. You mean because this? He gestured to the half-finished minigun mount. Is still my problem, because you're ditching me for your magic nerd stuff. And Ashley's off playing war? Eli sighed. I told you to finish it last week. Derren rolled his eyes. Yeah, well, last week I was busy keeping our asses alive. Remember that whole demon attack in the woods thing? Eli didn't look up. Excuses, excuses. Derren rubbed his face, looking at the unfinished setup. The Wolfmobile was a war machine, but it didn't drive itself, and it sure as hell didn't shoot itself. And that was the problem. He turned to Eli. We need another body. Eli, still focused on her work, muttered, The pack is stretched thin. Everyone's assigned. Derren leaned on the Wolfmobile, thinking. Then we get someone outside the pack. Eli stopped typing. Who? Derren grinned, knowing exactly how much she was going to hate what he was about to say. Caleb. Eli whipped around so fast she almost dropped her tablet. Are you out of your goddamn mind? Derren held up his hands. Look, I know he's a pain in the ass. A pain in the ass? Eli laughed bitterly. The guy hates us. He hates the pack. Hell, last time he was here, he nearly got eaten by Alpha. Twice. Derren shrugged. Yeah, but here's the thing, he's a good shot. Eli's glare was borderline murderous. That does not make him trustworthy. Come on, Keebler. You and I both know he's more pissed at the agency than he is at us. He's just bitter. Eli crossed her arms. That doesn't mean he wants to hop in a death machine and fight for us. Derren grinned. Doesn't mean he won't either. Eli huffed. Gunner's gonna love this. Derren snorted. Oh, I know. That's why I'm letting you tell him. Eli threw a wrench at him. Derren dodged, laughing. Derren ducked, laughing, and that's exactly when Gunner walked in. The sound of metal clanging off the floor was loud enough that Gunner paused in the doorway, one brow arching as he took in the scene before him. Eli was still mid-throwing motion. Derren was grinning like a dumbass, and the Wolfmobile's turret was still half-assembled. For a solid 3 seconds, Gunner just stood there. Then, his voice cut through the garage like a blade. Do I even want to know what the hell is going on? Eli froze. Derren, to his credit, barely hesitated before answering. Team-building exercise, he said smoothly. Eli threw up her hands. Gunner, I swear to God I was about to kill him. Gunner's eye twitched. He pinched the bridge of his nose. And that somehow explains why my gun turret isn't finished? Derren clapped his hands together. Oh, right. About that. We need a gunner. Gunner exhaled slowly. What? Derren grinned. For the turret, I nominate Caleb. Silence. Eli turned to Gunnar, her voice deadpan. See? See why I threw the wrench? Gunnar's jaw clenched. He stared at Derren like he was debating whether or not to throw something himself. You want to put Caleb, he said slowly. The guy who would rather chew glass than work with us, in charge of our biggest gun? Derren smirked. Yep. Eli folded her arms. Absolutely not. Derren looked between them. Come on, tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that we don't need another body. Tell me that Caleb isn't a damn good shot. Gunnar stared at him, then at Eli, then back at Derren. You're really pushing for this? Derren grinned wider. I love making you uncomfortable. Gunnar grunted, rubbing his temple. Fine. Eli blinked. Wait, what? Gunnar fixed Derren with a sharp look. You want him? You convince him. Derren's grin only grew. Oh, I will. Eli threw up her hands again. Unbelievable. Gunnar just shook his head. You two figure it out. I've got a war to prepare for. And with that, he left. Eli glared at Derren. If this backfires... Derren grinned. Relax, Keebler. Worst case scenario, Caleb tells me to go to hell. Eli sighed. And best case? Derren's grin turned cocky. I get to blow shit up with style. Derren found Rose in the small weapons bay down the hall. Derren leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. Damn, firecracker! You gonna sharpen that dagger all night, or you actually planning on using it? Rose, seated on a crate, didn't look up as she ran the silver dagger across a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape filling the space between them. She took her time responding. That depends, Derren. You volunteering? He chuckled, low, amused, and just enough to be irritating. Tempting, but I'd rather die in a more dignified way. Like a bar fight, or an explosion. Rose finally looked up, archway of an eyebrow, lips quirking. I can arrange that. Derren grinned, stepping inside and casually grabbing a throwing knife off the nearby table. He spun it between his fingers, watching her. Speaking of arrangements, I need a turret gunner for the Wolfmobile. Rose went completely still, just for a second. Then she resumed sharpening. And you're here. Why? Derren took his time walking around her, picking up one of her spare bullwhips, examining it with far too much interest. Figured you might have an opinion. Derren, she warned. He tossed the whip onto the table and leaned in, a little too close. Thinking Caleb. This time Rose did freeze, just for half a breath. Then she exhaled slowly and set the dagger down. Caleb? Yup. She gave him a long, unreadable look. Derren could almost see the wheels turning in her head. Why? She finally asked. Derren shrugged, keeping it casual. He's got the instincts. He's been in the field with you. And if I'm being honest, I'd rather have someone on the gun that doesn't mind getting their hands dirty. Caleb's not pack, Rose pointed out. Neither are you, Derren countered, tilting his head. But that's never stopped you from raising hell at my side, firecracker. Rose rolled her eyes. But there was something else there. You really think he'll say yes? I think he's more likely to say no just to piss me off. Rose snorted, because that was accurate. He won't say yes if he thinks you're screwing with him, she said, finally standing. Derren watched her carefully, noting the slight tension in her shoulders. So how do I get him to say yes? Rose crossed her arms. Caleb doesn't trust easily, but he trusts me, Evelyn, and Argos. If you want him on board, you better not make him feel like a damn outsider. Derren nodded, processing that. Then he smirked. You know, firecracker, if I didn't know any better, I'd think you actually cared. Rose gave him a look. And if I didn't know any better, I'd think you were actually capable of a well-thought-out decision. Derren grinned. Flirting with me won't distract me from the fact that you're avoiding the subject. Rose picked up her bullwhip, gave it an experimental flick, and coiled it neatly at her hip. Get out, Derren. Not even a little thank you for involving you in this brilliant decision. Rose smiled sweetly. You want a thank you? Stand still while I get my dagger. Derren barked out a laugh, holding his hands up in mock surrender. All right, I'll go. He turned, paused at the doorway, and looked back over his shoulder. You think he can handle it? Rose's smirk faded, just slightly. Caleb's handled a hell of a lot more than you realise. Derren didn't miss the shift in her tone, didn't push it either. Noted. And with that, he walked out, already working on his next plan. Caleb was elbow-deep in the engine to his SUV, his hands covered in grease as he worked on tuning it up. The faint sound of music crackled from an old radio nearby, the soft hum of a blues guitar, barely audible beneath the whir of tools and the occasional muttered curse from Caleb himself. He didn't look up when Derren stepped into the garage. If you're here to be an arse, come back later, I'm busy. Derren grinned, right on cue. Oh, don't worry, buddy. I wouldn't dream of interrupting your riveting date with a wrench. Caleb sighed, wiping his hands on a rag before finally turning. His sharp green eyes narrowed immediately. What do you want? Derren leaned against the workbench, arms crossed over his chest. I need a gunner for the Wolfmobile. Caleb stared at him, expression flat. And you're it? A beat of silence. Then Caleb laughed, short, sharp, and completely disbelieving. No. Derren barely blinked. That wasn't a request, partner. Caleb's amusement vanished. He grabbed a nearby wrench and pointed it at Derren. First off, don't call me that. Second, what the hell makes you think I'd sign up to be your trigger monkey? Derren's smirk never wavered. He pushed off the workbench and took a slow step forward. Because whether you admit it or not, you've got the instincts for it. You can read a battlefield, you don't freeze under pressure, and you sure as hell know how to fight. Caleb's jaw tightened. Yeah? And what part of my extensive resume makes you think I can handle a goddamn minigun? Derren grinned. You got 2 hands, don't you? Oh, screw off. Caleb turned back toward the engine, muttering under his breath. Go find someone else. Derren's voice dropped slightly. Can't. No time. Something in his tone made Caleb hesitate. Derren wasn't joking. Caleb turned back, finally studying him. How bad? Derren shrugged. We move in a few hours. First team needs to be light and fast, but we need backup. The Wolfmobile's our best bet for heavy fire support, and I need someone I trust on the turret. Caleb scoffed. Trust? Since when do you trust me? Derren rolled his eyes. I don't. But I trust Rose and she trusts you. So that's got to mean something, right? That hit differently. Caleb's fingers curled into a fist, and for a moment, he didn't respond. Then he exhaled sharply. If I say yes, and I screw it up, you won't. Caleb's green eyes locked onto Derren's. A long, silent exchange. Finally, Caleb gritted his teeth, tossed the wrench aside, and swiped the rag over his hands. Fine, but if this thing jams, I'm shooting you first. Derren grinned. Attaboy. Now let's go get you a crash course in point and shoot. Caleb muttered a string of curses, but followed him anyway. Because whether he liked it or not, he was in. Caleb grumbled under his breath as he followed Derren toward the Wolfmobile, already regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. So, let me get this straight, Caleb muttered, rolling his shoulders. Not only do I have to be the gunner, but now I have to install the damn thing too. Derren grinned, unbothered. You catch on quick, buddy. Caleb shot him a withering glare. Again, stop calling me that. Derren just patted the side of the armoured UTV like it was a prized stallion. Look, you want to ride in my baby, you gotta earn it. That minigun ain't gonna install itself, and Eli's busy making sure the world doesn't explode. So congratulations, you're officially my assistant mechanic. Caleb stared at him. Then at the disassembled turret system sitting in a heap next to the Wolfmobile. Then back at Derren's smug face. You're actually serious? Oh, yeah. Caleb exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. You do realize I've never installed a turret-mounted minigun before, right? Do you know what a wrench is? Derren asked. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Yes. Great. You're qualified. Caleb clenched his jaw, muttering a curse as he yanked off his jacket and tossed it onto a nearby crate. "You're a menace." "I get that a lot," Derren said cheerfully, tossing him a heavy-duty ratchet. "Now get to work." Caleb got to work immediately, rolling up his sleeves and studying the mounting system. The minigun itself, a beast of a weapon, lay on its side, gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the motor pool. "Okay," Caleb muttered to himself, running a hand over the turret's mounting bracket. "Turret cradle looks solid, but you didn't lock down the pivot bolts. If this thing takes a hit, the whole mount could shear off." Derren arched a brow. "Huh. You actually know what you're talking about." Caleb gave him a dry look. "You expected me to be an idiot?" "No, I just expected you to be bad at following instructions." Caleb ignored him and got back to work, tightening the pivot bolts before adjusting the ammo feed system. The 2,000 rounds of enchanted ammo Eli had set aside were stacked in steel-lined boxes, prepped for loading. "All right, genius," Derren said, leaning against the frame. "How long before she's good to go?" Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. "Give me 20 minutes, maybe 15 if you shut up and stop distracting me." Derren smirked. "Not a chance." 20 minutes later, Caleb locked the last bolt into place and took a step back, inspecting his handiwork. "That should do it," he said, rolling his shoulders. Derren whistled. "Not bad, rookie. Now let's see if it works." He hopped into the driver's seat, firing up the Wolfmobile's systems. The armoured beast rumbled to life, engine growling as the console lights flickered on. Caleb climbed up to the turret seat, gripping the minigun's handles. The weapon felt heavy, the smooth metal cool beneath his fingers. The HUD display flickered on, showing targeting assist and ammo diagnostics. "All right, cowboy," Derren called up. "Let her rip." Caleb tested the turret's rotation, the motorized mount humming smoothly as he aimed toward the designated test targets. Old wrecked armor plating set up downrange. Then with a deep breath he pulled the trigger. The minigun roared to life. BRRRRRTTTTT. A stream of gold and silver tracers lit up the range, enchanted rounds interwoven with standard munitions shredding through the metal plates. Sparks erupted, smoke rising from the obliterated targets. Caleb held it for 3 seconds, then released the trigger. The minigun spun down, its barrels steaming. Derren let out a low whistle. "Well, damn. Guess I don't have to train you after all." Caleb cracked his knuckles. "You told me. Point and shoot." Derren grinned. "Welcome to the big leagues, kid."